"He brings more than mail," Mrs. Adelaide Morrison shouted to Ray Charles as he approached Ellis Auditorium in Memphis. She was pointing at Neil Whitmore, the neighborhood mailman who was walking away with his head down, his weathered postal bag slung over his shoulder. "That man saved my life last winter," she continued, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who needed to be heard. "And he's helped dozens of families on this street." Ray Charles stopped in his tracks on that humid Memphis afternoon in July 1976. He had been heading to the venue for sound check, his white cane tapping rhythmically on the sidewalk, when this unexpected declaration made him pause. There was something in Mrs. Morrison's voice, a mixture of gratitude and desperation, that told him this was a story he needed to hear. "Ma'am," Ray said, turning toward the voice, "tell me about this mailman." Adelaide Morrison was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived on Elm Street for 45 years. She had watched the neighborhood change, seen families come and go, witnessed the small dramas and quiet tragedies that make up the fabric of any community. But in all those years, she had never seen anyone quite like Neil Whitmore. "Mr. Charles," she began, her voice gaining strength, "Neil Whitmore has been our mailman for 30 years. 30 years of walking these streets in rain, snow, heat, you name it. But that's not what makes him special, it's what he does beyond delivering mail." Ray Charles listened intently as Adelaide painted a picture of a man who had transformed the simple act of delivering mail into something approaching ministry. Neil knew every family on his route, not just their names and addresses, but their struggles, their joys, their needs. "Last winter," Adelaide continued, "I fell and broke my hip. Couldn't get to the door for 3 days. Neil noticed I hadn't picked up my mail, and he used his key to check on me. Found me on the kitchen floor, called the ambulance, stayed with me until my daughter arrived from Nashville. Doctor said another few hours, and I might not have made it." But Adelaide's story was just the beginning. As she talked, other neighbors began to gather, drawn by the sight of Ray Charles standing on their street corner. Each had their own Neil Whitmore story to tell. 80-year-old Clarence Beaumont shuffled over, leaning heavily on his walking cane. "Neil's been bringing me groceries for 5 years, he said simply. "I can't drive anymore, and my Social Security don't stretch far enough for delivery fees. Neil picks up my list on Fridays, shops on his lunch break, brings everything by after his route. Won't take a penny for it." Margaret Holloway, a young mother with 3 small children, had tears in her eyes as she spoke. "When my husband deployed to Vietnam, Neil became like a guardian angel to our family. He'd check on us daily, help with small repairs around the house, even played catch with my boys when they missed their daddy too much. He's not just delivering mail, he's holding this community together." Ray Charles was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something extraordinary. In an era when communities were becoming increasingly fragmented, when people barely knew their neighbors' names, Neil Whitmore had created something different on his postal route. He had built relationships that went far beyond the professional obligation to deliver mail. "Where is Neil now?" Ray asked. "Probably headed home," Adelaide replied. "He finishes his route around 4, then goes to check on Mrs. Patterson. She's 91, lives alone, and Neil stops by every evening to make sure she's taken her medications and has everything she needs." Ray Charles made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. "Can you show me where he lives?" The small group of neighbors exchanged glances. Ray Charles wanting to visit their mailman seemed almost too good to be true. But Adelaide Morrison, who had spent 40 years teaching children and could recognize genuine interest when she saw it, nodded and began walking. Neil Whitmore lived in a modest duplex 3 blocks from his postal route, a tidy home with a small garden that he tended in the evenings after his rounds. When Ray Charles knocked on his door, accompanied by several neighbors, Neil's initial reaction was confusion bordering on panic. "Charles," Neil stammered. What can I do for you? Is there some problem with your mail delivery?" Ray Charles smiled at the question. Even faced with an unexpected visit from one of the world's most famous musicians, Neil's first concern was whether he had somehow failed in his postal duties. "No problem with the mail, Neil," Ray said gently. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about you. Mind if we talk?" What followed was one of the most revealing conversations Ray Charles had ever had about the nature of service and community. Neil, initially shy and self-deprecating, gradually opened up about his approach to his job. "I guess I just don't see it as only delivering mail," Neil explained as they sat in his small living room. "These people, they're not just addresses on envelopes. They're my neighbors. When you walk the same streets every day for 30 years, you start to notice things. You see when someone's struggling, when they need help." Ray Charles leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me what you mean by notice things." Neil's examples were both heartbreaking and inspiring. He told Ray about recognizing the early signs of Mrs. Henderson's dementia when she started leaving confused notes for the mailman. Instead of simply reporting it to authorities, Neil had quietly arranged for her adult children to visit more frequently and helped coordinate with social services to provide support. He described how he had identified 3 different cases of domestic violence on his route over the years, carefully documenting evidence and working with police and social workers to help the victims find safety and resources. In each case, he had been the first to notice because he was often the only person who visited these homes regularly. "There's Mrs. Chen," Neil continued, "whose English isn't so good. She gets confused by official letters, scared she's in trouble with the government. So I help her understand what's important and what's just junk mail. Help her fill out forms sometimes, make sure she doesn't miss important deadlines." Ray Charles was struck by the systematic way Neil had transformed his postal route into a comprehensive community support network. It wasn't random acts of kindness, it was a thoughtful, sustained approach to using his unique position as someone who visited every home to identify and address community needs. "Neil," Ray said, "do you realize what you've created here?" Neil looked puzzled. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Charles. Maybe a little extra, but nothing special." "Nothing special?" Adelaide Morrison interjected from the kitchen doorway where she had been listening. "Neil, you've saved at least 4 lives that I know of. You've kept families together, helped kids stay in school, made sure elderly people didn't die alone. That's not nothing special. Nothing special, that's extraordinary." Ray Charles nodded thoughtfully. He understood something that Neil himself didn't fully grasp. The mailman had created a model of community care that was both practical and profoundly effective. In an era when social services were often overwhelmed and disconnected from the people they served, Neil had developed an approach that was personal, responsive, and sustainable. "Neil," Ray said, "I want to ask you something. What happens when you retire?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Neil's face fell, and for the first time in the conversation, he looked truly distressed. "That's what keeps me up at night," Neil admitted. "Postal Service says I have to retire in 2 years. They're talking about consolidating routes, having younger carriers cover more ground with trucks instead of walking. More efficient, they say." "But what about all the people you help?" Ray asked. "That's just it," Neil said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know. I've trained the younger carriers when they've covered my route, tried to explain about Mrs. Patterson's medications and Mr. Beaumont's grocery needs. But they see it as extra work, not part of the job. They're not wrong. Officially, it isn't part of the job." Ray Charles was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had learned. Here was a man who had spent 30 years building something invaluable, a network of care and support that had become essential to dozens of families. And it was all going to disappear because institutional systems couldn't recognize or accommodate the value of what he had created. "Neil," Ray said, finally, "what if I told you that your work here is so important that it shouldn't end with your retirement? What if there was a way to make sure this kind of community care continued?" That evening, Ray Charles called off his scheduled sound check and instead spent 4 hours walking Neil's postal route, meeting the families who had come to depend on the mailman's daily presence. What he discovered was a community that had remained stable and connected in ways that were increasingly rare in 1970s America. The Hendersons, an elderly couple dealing with the wife's advancing dementia, showed Ray the detailed care instructions Neil had helped them develop. The Rodriguez family, recent immigrants from El Salvador, explained how Neil had helped them navigate the complex process of applying for permanent residency. The Washingtons, a working-class family struggling with their teenage son's behavioral problems, described how Neil's patient mentorship had helped the boy turn his life around. "This isn't just mail delivery," Ray told Augustus Fairchild, the venue manager, when he finally arrived for his delayed sound check. "This man has created something that should be studied and replicated. He's solved problems that government programs and social services struggle with every day." Ray Charles' concert that night was dedicated to the unsung heroes who hold our communities together. But more importantly, it marked the beginning of a campaign that would fundamentally change how America thought about community service and the role of public servants. The next morning, Ray Charles arranged a meeting with Memphis city officials, postal service administrators, and community leaders. His proposal was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of forcing Neil Whitmore into traditional retirement, the city should create a new position that would allow him to continue his community work while training others in his methods. "Neil has developed expertise that can't be replaced," Ray argued in the meeting. "He's created a model of community care that's more effective and cost-efficient than many traditional social services. Instead of losing this knowledge when he retires, we should be figuring out how to preserve and expand it." The initial reaction was skeptical. Postal administrators worried about setting precedents that could complicate labor agreements. City officials questioned whether local government should be involved in what seemed like federal postal service issues. Social service agencies were concerned about boundary issues and professional credentials, but Ray Charles had done his homework. He had spent the previous evening documenting the economic impact of Neil's work, calculating the costs that would be incurred if his informal support network disappeared. Emergency room visits by elderly residents would likely increase without Neil's daily check-ins. Social services would need to expand programs to replace the assistance Neil provided to families navigating bureaucratic systems. Police and family courts would probably see increased domestic violence cases without Neil's early intervention work. "The question isn't whether we can afford to create a position for Neil," Ray argued. "The question is whether we can afford not to." The breakthrough came when Dr. Patricia Kellerman, a social work professor at the University of Memphis, attended one of the planning meetings. She immediately recognized the significance of what Neil had accomplished. "What Mr. Whitmore has created is a perfect example of what we call asset-based community development," Dr. Kellerman explained to the group. Instead of identifying community problems and trying to fix them with outside resources, he's identified community strengths and helped people help themselves. This approach is getting national attention in academic circles, but we rarely see it implemented so effectively at the grassroots level. Dr. Kellerman's endorsement provided the academic credibility that city officials needed to support Ray Charles' proposal. Within 6 weeks, Memphis had created a new position, Community Connection Coordinator, with Neil Whitmore as the first person to hold the title. The role was jointly funded by the city, the Postal Service, and a consortium of local businesses that Ray Charles had convinced to contribute. Neil would continue to walk his route, but now as an official community liaison rather than just a mail carrier. He would be responsible for identifying community needs, connecting residents with resources, and training other postal workers and community volunteers in his methods. The innovation attracted attention from cities across the country. Urban planners, social workers, and public policy experts came to Memphis to study the Whitmore model of community engagement. The Postal Service, initially resistant to the idea, began to recognize the public relations value of having their employees seen as community heroes rather than just mail deliverers. Neil himself was overwhelmed by the attention. "I still can't believe all this fuss is about me just doing my job," he told Ray Charles during one of their regular conversations. "Neil," Ray replied, "you need to understand something. What you do isn't just anything. You've shown that one person who cares enough to pay attention can make a difference in dozens of lives. That's not common. That's extraordinary." The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Within a year, Neil had trained 12 other postal workers and community volunteers in his approach to neighborhood engagement. Incidents requiring emergency services dropped by 15% in the areas covered by the program. School attendance improved among children whose families participated in the support network. Elderly residents reported higher levels of satisfaction with their living situations and decreased feelings of isolation. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the culture of community service in Memphis. Neil's example inspired similar initiatives in other city departments. Police officers began developing deeper relationships with residents on their beats. Sanitation workers started reporting maintenance needs and safety hazards they observed during their routes. City bus drivers became informal sources of information and assistance for passengers who needed help navigating social services. Ray Charles continued to support and promote the program throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. He performed at fundraising events, spoke at conferences about community development, and helped other cities adapt the Memphis model to their local conditions. "Music taught me that harmony comes from different voices working together," Ray often said in these presentations. "Neil showed me that community works the same way. You can't create it from the outside, it has to grow from people who know each other, who care about each other, who pay attention to each other's needs." The academic world took notice as well. Dr. Kellerman's research on the Memphis program became influential in urban planning and social work education. The Whitmore method was taught in graduate programs across the country as an example of effective grassroots community development. Neil's own evolution was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The shy, self-deprecating mailman who had insisted he was just doing his job gradually became a confident advocate for community-based approaches to social problems. He spoke at national conferences, consulted with other cities developing similar programs, and co-authored research papers with Dr. Kellerman about effective community engagement strategies. "Ray Charles taught me that what I was doing mattered," Neil reflected years later. "But more than that, he taught me that I had a responsibility to share what I'd learned." Once you know that your work can make a difference in people's lives, you can't just keep that knowledge to yourself. The ripple effects of that July afternoon encounter between Ray Charles and Neil Whitmore continued for decades. The Memphis model influenced federal policy on community policing, neighborhood-based social services, and the role of public employees in community development. Cities from Seattle to Miami adapted elements of the program to address local challenges. International attention came as well. Urban planners from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia studied the Memphis approach as a model for strengthening community connections in an increasingly fragmented world. The United Nations Human Settlements Program cited the Whitmore method as an example of best practices in community development. Neil worked in his community connection coordinator role until he was 73, 15 years beyond traditional retirement age. When he finally stepped down in 1991, the program he had inspired was operating in more than 200 cities across North America. The farewell celebration for Neil was held at Ellis Auditorium, the same venue where Ray Charles had first learned about the mailman's work 15 years earlier. Ray Charles performed "What a Wonderful World," dedicating it to a man who made the world more wonderful just by paying attention to his neighbors. In his retirement speech, Neil made a simple observation that captured the essence of what he had accomplished. "I learned that being a good neighbor isn't complicated. You just have to notice when people need help and then help them. Everything else builds from there. Ray Charles, who had championed Neil's work from the beginning, reflected on the broader implications of the mailman's legacy. Neil showed us that you don't need special training or advanced degrees to make a difference in your community. You just need to care enough to pay attention and act on what you see. The memorial garden planted in Neil's honor outside the Memphis Community Services Building includes a plaque with his simple philosophy: notice, care, act. These 3 words became the unofficial motto of community service programs across the country. Today, more than 40 years after Ray Charles first heard Adelaide Morrison shout, "He brings more than mail," the principles Neil Whitmore embodied continue to influence approaches to community development and public service. His story serves as a reminder that extraordinary community impact can emerge from ordinary people who choose to see their work as more than just a job. The partnership between Ray Charles and Neil Whitmore demonstrates how recognition and support from influential figures can transform local innovations into movements with national significance. It shows that sustainable community change often comes not from top-down programs but from the grassroots efforts of individuals who understand that true service means seeing and responding to the full humanity of the people around them. In an era when technology increasingly mediates human connections and community bonds seem fragile, Neil Whitmore's legacy offers hope that personal attention, genuine care, and consistent presence can still create the kind of neighborhoods where people look out for each other, where no one falls through the cracks, and where the simple act of delivering mail becomes an act of love. The research conducted on the Memphis model revealed surprising insights about the nature of effective community intervention. Traditional social service approaches often failed because they were reactive rather than preventive, formal rather than personal, and temporary rather than sustained. Neil's method succeeded because it was built on relationships developed over years of daily contact, trust earned through consistent reliability, and interventions that felt like neighbor helping neighbor rather than institutional assistance. Dr. Kellerman's longitudinal study, following families in Neil's network for 15 years, documented measurable improvements in multiple quality-of-life indicators. Children in participating families showed higher graduation rates and lower involvement with juvenile justice systems. Elderly residents experienced fewer medical emergencies and reported greater life satisfaction. Overall neighborhood crime rates declined as social cohesion increased. The economic analysis was equally compelling. The cost of Neil's salary and program administration was less than half what the city would have spent providing equivalent services through traditional agencies. Emergency room visits by elderly residents dropped by 30%. Police calls for domestic disturbances decreased by 40%. The return on investment exceeded 300% within 5 years of implementation. These results caught the attention of federal policymakers looking for cost-effective approaches to community development. The Department of Housing and Urban Development began offering grants to cities interested in implementing Whitmore model programs. The Department of Health and Human Services funded research into how the approach could be integrated with existing social service systems. Corporate America also took notice. Companies began recognizing that employees like Neil, who understood community needs through their daily work, could be valuable partners in corporate social responsibility initiatives. UPS and FedEx developed pilot programs training their drivers to identify and report community needs. Utility companies created protocols for their service technicians to assist elderly or vulnerable customers beyond their technical responsibilities. The labor movement initially viewed these developments with suspicion, concerned that expanding job responsibilities might lead to exploitation without additional compensation. However, when unions realized that community service roles like Neil's came with higher pay, better benefits, and increased job security, attitudes shifted. The American Postal Workers Union began advocating for the creation of community liaison positions as a natural evolution of postal service. Educational institutions incorporated Neil's story into curricula ranging from social work to urban planning to public administration. Business schools used the Memphis model as a case study in stakeholder engagement and community-based problem-solving. The simple mailman who had insisted he was just doing his job became the subject of academic papers, policy briefs, and graduate dissertations. International delegations came to Memphis to study the program firsthand. Representatives from Canada's Postal Service adapted elements of Neil's approach to address rural isolation in remote communities. British social services incorporated community connector positions into their neighborhood support systems. The European Union funded pilot programs in 6 countries, testing variations of the Memphis model. The personal transformation experienced by Neil himself became an important part of the program's appeal. His evolution from self-deprecating postal worker to confident community advocate demonstrated that leadership potential could emerge from unexpected places when people were given appropriate support and recognition. "I never thought of myself as a leader," Neil reflected in a 1985 interview. "I just saw problems that needed solving and tried to help. But Ray Charles taught me that sometimes helping means more than just solving individual problems. Sometimes it means helping others understand how to solve problems themselves." This philosophy of empowerment, rather than dependency, became central to how the Memphis model was replicated elsewhere. Instead of creating programs where professional service providers did things for community members, the approach focused on identifying and supporting existing community assets. People like Neil, who were already making a difference, but might not recognize the value of their contributions. The success stories that emerged from the expanded program were both heartwarming and statistically significant. Maria Santos, a school crossing guard in Phoenix, used Neil's methods to identify and assist 17 families dealing with food insecurity, connecting them with resources while maintaining their dignity. Robert Chen, a sanitation worker in Portland, became a trusted mediator in neighborhood disputes, helping prevent minor conflicts from escalating into police matters. Ray Charles continued to champion the program until his death in 2004. At his memorial service, Neil Whitmore was invited to speak about their friendship and its impact on American community. His remarks were simple but profound. "Ray Charles saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. But more than that, he helped me understand that what I saw in my neighbors, their strength, their resilience, their willingness to help each other, was the foundation for building stronger communities." The Ray Charles Community Connection Foundation, established after the musician's death, continues to support community connector programs nationwide. The foundation provides training, resources, and advocacy for individuals and communities interested in implementing asset-based approaches to community development. Today, more than 400 cities across North America have some form of community connector program, most tracing their origins to the pioneering work done in Memphis. The roles have evolved and diversified. NISTA community connectors now include librarians, bus drivers, maintenance workers, and others whose jobs bring them into regular contact with community members. The technological revolution of the 21st century has both challenged and enhanced the community connector approach. While social media and digital communication have changed how people interact, the fundamental need for personal attention and human connection remains constant. Modern community connectors use technology to coordinate resources and share information while maintaining the personal relationships that make their work effective. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 highlighted the continued relevance of Neil's approach. Community connectors across the country became essential workers in the truest sense, checking on isolated elderly residents, coordinating food deliveries for quarantined families, and maintaining social connections when physical distancing requirements separated neighbors. Dr. Kellerman, now in her 80s, continues to research and write about community development. Her most recent book, The Mailman's Legacy: How One Person's Attention Changed American Communities, documents the long-term impact of the Memphis model and its influence on contemporary approaches to social problems. Neil Whitmore and Ray Charles showed us something important about how change happens, Dr. Kellerman writes. Real transformation doesn't usually come from grand gestures or massive programs. It comes from ordinary people doing extraordinary things with attention, care, and persistence. The memorial bench installed in Neil's honor outside the Ellis Auditorium bears a simple inscription that captures the essence of his contribution. He noticed. He cared. He acted. He taught others to do the same. These words continue to inspire community connectors around the world who understand that the most profound changes often begin with the simple decision to pay attention to the people around us. The story of Ray Charles and Neil Whitmore reminds us that heroism doesn't require fame or fortune, it requires the willingness to see our daily work as an opportunity to serve others and the courage to act on that vision even when no one is watching. It demonstrates that when influential people recognize and support grassroots innovation, the impact can extend far beyond what either the innovator or the supporter imagined possible. In communities across America and around the world, postal workers, bus drivers, maintenance staff, and others in public-facing jobs continue to follow Neil's example, understanding that their positions give them unique opportunities to strengthen the social fabric of their communities. They carry forward the legacy of a shy mailman who insisted he was just doing his job while quietly revolutionizing how we think about community service, public responsibility, and the power of paying attention to our neighbors. The institutional changes that grew from Neil's example extended beyond individual programs to influence fundamental approaches to public service delivery. Government agencies began redesigning job descriptions to include community engagement components. Training programs for public employees incorporated modules on identifying and responding to community needs. Performance evaluations started including measures of community impact alongside traditional productivity metrics. Private sector companies adopted similar approaches, recognizing that employees who interacted with the public could serve as valuable sources of community intelligence and goodwill. Delivery companies trained drivers to identify elderly customers who might need additional assistance. Utility companies empowered service technicians to connect customers with energy assistance programs. Even retail workers received training in recognizing signs of domestic violence or elder abuse. The insurance industry took particular interest in community connector programs, recognizing their potential to reduce claims through preventive intervention. Several major insurers began offering premium discounts to communities with active connector programs, creating financial incentives for local governments to invest in these initiatives. The transformative power of Neil's approach lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. By treating every human interaction as an opportunity for connection and service, he had demonstrated that extraordinary community impact could emerge from ordinary daily activities. This accessibility made the model attractive to communities with limited resources, but strong social networks. Rural communities found the approach particularly valuable, adapting Neil's methods to address challenges specific to geographic isolation and limited services. Small-town postal workers became informal coordinators for everything from medical transportation to emergency response. In agricultural areas, mail carriers developed expertise in connecting farmers with resources for everything from crop insurance to mental health support. Urban adaptations focused on building connections across diverse populations and complex service systems. City postal workers learned to navigate multiple languages and cultural contexts while connecting residents with appropriate resources. The personal relationships that Neil had emphasized became even more crucial in environments where institutional distrust was common. The sustainability of community connector programs depended largely on institutional commitment and adequate funding. Successful programs typically involve partnerships between multiple agencies and organizations, spreading costs while ensuring comprehensive support for community connectors. The most effective initiatives included ongoing training, regular supervision, and clear protocols for handling complex situations that exceeded individual capacity. As Neil entered his 90s, he remained active as an elder statesman of the community development movement. His final public appearance was at the 2010 National Community Connector Conference, where he received a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to American social policy. His acceptance speech consisted of just 3 sentences: pay attention to your neighbors, care about what you see, do something to help. The simplicity of Neil's message belied the profound impact of his life's work. From a chance encounter with Ray Charles on a Memphis street corner, he had sparked a movement that transformed how America approached community development, public service, and social responsibility. His legacy serves as a reminder that the most lasting changes often begin with individual choices to see our work as more than just a job, and our neighbors as more than just the people who happen to live nearby. The story of Neil Whitmore and Ray Charles demonstrates that recognition and support from influential figures can amplify grassroots innovation in ways that create lasting institutional change. It shows that sustainable community development emerges not from top-down mandates, but from the accumulated actions of individuals who understand that caring for others is both a personal responsibility and a civic duty. Today, as communities worldwide face challenges ranging from social isolation to climate change to economic inequality, Neil's example offers hope that solutions can emerge from unexpected places when people choose to pay attention, care deeply, and act consistently on behalf of their neighbors. His life reminds us that heroism is not about grand gestures, but about the daily choice to see our ordinary work as an opportunity for extraordinary service.